Welcome to Solo, the world's most dangerous dog podcast. Join Solo and his long-suffering family in various misadventures about the trouble the best dog in the world can cause.
Solo and the Homeless Man. Solo was in the back of his family's SUV, looking out onto the rainy street and wondering, not for the first time, what it was humans found so important to do that they would brave all weathers to do it. His family had driven to the large town not far from their village in order to do some shopping. The children had quite naturally wanted to stay behind. "We're teenagers now," was their reasoning. While this was true for their son, it wasn't true for their daughter, and so for Mum and Dad, the idea of leaving two youngsters in the house alone for any length of time was too dire to contemplate. Almost as terrifying as the thought of leaving Solo home alone. It was decided that the entire family would be packed into the family SUV for a short shopping trip. Dad certainly hoped it would be a short trip. He was giving up a morning of golf for this. It was well known in his family that the more miserable the weather, the more content Dad was on the golf course. Head bowed against the wind and rain, pulling his golf clubs behind him, water dripping off the end of his nose, was heaven to Dad. Most people would find this a miserable experience, but Dad found it exhilarating. Dad now shook his head as he glanced out at the heavy rain through the front windscreen, the rain coming down so hard that the wipers were having a hard time keeping up. Dad and Mum were keeping an eye out for a parking space. As much as Dad loved to be out in this type of weather playing golf, he didn't want to be out in it when all he was doing was shopping. So he was desperately looking for a parking spot as close to the shops as possible. Meanwhile, in the back of the car, Solo was looking at the humans running here and there, to and fro, hither and thither, once more wondering why these humans didn't simply stay indoors by a nice warm fire and take a much-deserved nap. Even in the back of the SUV, Solo was quite cozy. His family had taken care of that. He had a nice pillow for him to rest his head and two soft blankets for lying down. Sometimes Mum and Dad thought Solo had it too easy, especially when they considered all the trouble he could cause. But they could never stay angry at him for too long. All he had to do was look at them with his big black eyes and the silly smile on his face, and they forgave Solo just about anything. All in all, Solo was quite content as Dad drove through the rainy streets looking for a place to park. The longer the search took, the more Dad came to understand he might not get to play golf at all that day. The kids in the back were asked to help find a space as well. They were quite bored. They knew what lay ahead. They had to get some new sports clothes for school, and that would mean going to several stores before Mum was satisfied with the result. The kids wanted to get home as well. They wanted to play video games and talk to friends on the computer. They used the time looking for a parking space to once again whine about not having cell phones. "If we had phones, we could look at the traffic and help find a spot to park," they reminded their parents. Their parents ignored them. "There!" Dad yelled, and sure enough there was a space on the other side of the street, but before he could turn the car around, another driver grabbed it. Dad muttered something under his breath, but suddenly, directly in front of them, a car pulled out, and mercifully, Dad was able to get the car in one swift maneuver. "Did you see how well I parked?" he boasted to his wife. Mum raised an eyebrow. She opened her door and got out into the rain. "Come on, kids, let's go. The sooner we get this finished, the sooner we can all go home." Moaning about being out on a miserable wet day, the kids climbed down. As Dad got out, he turned and looked at Solo. "We'll be back soon, Solo." And with that, he got out and walked after his family into the rain. Solo watched them go. He was quite content. He would certainly rather be in the back of the car than left at home on his own. Even though he was stuck in a smaller space than being in the house, at least here he could continue watching people, and they're trying to avoid getting wet. Why go out in the rain if you didn't want to get wet? Humans are funny, thought Solo, not for the first time. As he glanced around, Solo noticed something. He had been looking down the street on the side the car was parked, but across the street was an old church with an old black metal fence around it. The fence ran up against the pedestrian area and the very wet humans. Sitting on the wet ground, his legs outstretched so that those walking by had to avoid falling over him, was an old man. He had a large, clear piece of plastic wrapped around his head and down to his knees, attempting to keep the rain off. Unfortunately, the plastic sheet wasn't big enough to cover him entirely. Either the top part of this man was going to get wet, or the bottom half was. The man had chosen to keep his head and body dry as best he could. Meanwhile, his legs were getting very wet indeed. He also looked very cold. Solo pondered the old man. His hair was very grey, and he had a ragged and equally grey beard. He also had a small tin cup in front of him, into which, for some reason Solo couldn't understand, passers-by would, on very rare occasions, toss coins. Those that did so didn't even stop in the process. Solo was confused by this. Often he had heard Dad complain about the amount of money the family spent on things which he claimed they didn't really need. Yet here were strangers tossing money into the old man's cup for seemingly no reason at all, not even having conversations about it. Solo decided to spend more time watching what the old man did. In order to get comfortable, he turned his body to face across the street, towards the church and the old man, and then rested his head on the small shelving that ran down the sides of the cargo area of the SUV. As he rested his head, he could see the rain was easing up a bit. The old man moved slightly, picking up his cup and looking into it as if to see how much money he had collected. Suddenly, he stood up and shuffled away down the street, still clutching his thin piece of plastic around his head and shoulders. Solo raised an eyebrow as he watched the old man and wondered if he would ever see him again and where he was going. As the old man disappeared down the street, Solo noticed that he had left a bag of belongings the other side of the old black metal fence inside the churchyard. Solo grew worried. He barked. "Hey, you forgot something!" He was trying to alert the old man. But it was no use. First, Solo was inside a car. Second, he was too far away. And third, the splash and noise of the passing traffic would make it impossible for the man to hear. Solo decided to watch over the man's belongings. Every time he thought someone came too close to them, even though they were on the other side of the fence in the churchyard across the street, Solo would let out a soft growl. And as no one took the man's bags, Solo felt confident that it was his skill as a guard dog that had protected them. He had no doubt whatsoever that the humans across the street could hear his discouraging growl despite the rain and the traffic. Soon the rain had stopped completely. With no sign of the old man, and seeing no one taking his forgotten possessions, Solo decided it was time for a nice nap. After all this watching out for thieves was tiring work. Solo did his usual circular routine and laid down on his nice, warm blankets. He was awoken by the return of his family. As they unlocked the car, Solo sat up and immediately looked to see if the old man had returned to pick up his bags. He was relieved to see they were still there, and now too was the old man. And while it had stopped raining, Solo could see, even from across the street, that he was doing his best to stay warm. Although now he seemed to have a large paper cup of some kind. Solo presumed that whatever was in the cup, it was warm, as steam rose from it. But as the man laid on the damp concrete, Solo noticed he was wrapping his hands around the cup, savoring its warmth. Mum, Dad, and the kids got in the car. Then he heard Mum say, "We need to take Solo for a quick rest break, in case he needs to go to the toilet. We were longer than I thought we'd be." "I suppose you mean I need to take him," said Dad. "Well, you're always telling us Solo is your dog, and you're the one who found him, so yeah, I was saying that," said Mum, giving her husband a wide grin. "All right then, come on, Solo." Dad sighed as he got back out and opened up the rear door of the SUV. Normally, Solo would be ready and willing to jump right out, even if all it meant was a quick bathroom break, but Solo was distracted by the old grey man across the street. Why was he still there? It was getting darker and colder. Why didn't he go home? "Come on, Solo," said Dad as he stood at the back of the car and snapped his fingers. "The sooner I take you across to the old church, the sooner you can go to the bathroom if needed, and we can go home." Dad knew it was too late to play golf now, but he had a good book at home, and the idea of reading curled up by the fire on this cold and miserable day was more appealing by the minute. Solo, who was still looking at the old man, didn't move. Dad was about to tell Solo to hurry up when Solo decided that while he didn't understand why the old man wasn't going home, the least Solo could do was help him get warm. He looked down. He did, after all, have 2 blankets. Surely the old man would appreciate one of these. Before Dad could stop him, Solo picked up one of the blankets by the edge in his big mouth and jumped out, dragging the blanket behind him as he ran across the street. Fortunately, traffic had thinned by this point, and Solo made it across the street quite safely as he ignored Dad's yells to stop. He immediately went up to the old man, who seemed to be staring off into the distance and at first didn't notice Solo at all. Solo, still clutching one of his favorite blankets in his mouth, attempted to hand it to the old man, but the blanket was large, much larger than Solo, and he kept treading on it as he tried to pull it, which slowed him down. So by the time he reached the old man, Dad had caught up with him. Grabbing Solo by the collar, Dad yelled at him, "Solo, what on earth are you doing? You could have been run over by a car!" Solo, still ignoring him, pushed the blanket onto the old man's lap. Dad, then seemingly noticing the man for the first time, let go of Solo's collar and stood back. "Oh, sorry," he said to the old man. "My dog, I mean, sorry." Dad was at a loss for words. The old man, noticing the blanket now, pulled it off his lap and held part of it to his face, which broke into a massive, toothless smile. Dad looked at the old man. Then he looked at Solo. Could it be? He thought. Dad knelt down beside the old man and Solo. "I believe my dog wants you to have his blanket." The old man, not saying a word, simply continued to hug the blanket, Dad, still slightly at a loss, noticed the man's tin cup, which he used to collect money. Dad took out his wallet and added his last remaining banknotes into the cup. The man, seeing this, held out a grimy, cold hand to Dad, but before Dad could shake it, Solo moved forward and stuck out his paw. The old man gently shook it, then leaned in and kissed Solo on the forehead. When Dad and Solo made it back to the rear door of the SUV, Mum asked what had happened. Dad replied, "I'll tell you when we get home." Then, looking at Solo, he said, "Come on, Solo, jump in. You deserve a nice supper." But Solo didn't move. Instead, he let out a few small barks. These were the higher-pitched barks he used when he wanted something. "What?" said Dad. Solo barked his high-pitched bark again. Then, looking in the back of the car, Dad understood. Without saying a word, he took Solo's second blanket and walked across the street to give it to the old man. As Dad was giving the old man the blanket, Solo jumped into the back of the car, watching Dad and the old man. This time, as Dad handed the blanket over, the old man seemed to say something to Dad, but it was so quiet that Dad had to lean in close to hear. The family was quiet all the way home, and after they had all been fed, including Solo, and the kids had gone to bed, Mum and Dad sat at the large kitchen table to talk about the day's events. Solo, quite naturally, was under the table in his favourite spot, not too close to the wood-burning stove so as to get too hot, but not too far away so as not to feel the warmth, listening in to the conversation. "Are you going to tell me what that man said just as you were leaving?" asked Mum. "Of course," Dad said, then paused. Looking at his wife, he said, "He told me Solo reminded him of a dog he once had. That his dog had died many years ago, when once he had a family of his own. He told me that Solo was family, and that Solo knew he was family, and that we must never, ever forget that." "How could we?" said Mum. Solo, listening to every word, decided he couldn't agree more.
Find this story and more in the Books of Solo's Adventures at Amazon.com and at solothedog.com, with illustrations by Stephanie Schultz, edited by Catherine Perkins, published by Heavy Media. Ask for Solo at your favorite bookstore.